Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Gordon, host of the Asian Review of Books podcast, done in partnership with the New Books Network. On this show, we interview fiction and nonfiction authors writing in, around, and about the Asia-Pacific region. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced Executive Order 9066, which authorized the confinement of tens of thousands of Japanese and Japanese Americans living in the Western U.S., sending them to cramped, hastily constructed camps like Manzanar and Amache. One such Japanese American was Karl Yoneda, a well-known labor activist and the husband of Elaine, a Jewish American woman. Elaine soon followed her husband to the Manzanar camp after authorities threatened to send her 3-year-old mixed-race son, Thomas, to the camp alone. The Yoneda's time in the camp is the subject of Tracy Slater's book, Together in Manzanar, The True Story of a Japanese Jewish Family in an American Concentration Camp, from Chicago Review Press. Tracy is a Jewish-American writer from Boston, based in her husband's country of Japan. Her previous book was the mixed marriage memoir, The Good Shufu, Finding Love, Self, and Home on the Far Side of the World. She has also published work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Time Magazine's Made by History, and more. Tracy, thank you so much for coming on the show today. First question, why did you want to tell the story of the Yonedas? How did you come across this history?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Nicholas, it's great to be here with you. I was interested in the intersection between Jewish American and Japanese American history. As you said in the introduction, I'm a Jewish American. My husband is Japanese from Japan. He's not Japanese American. And when we had our child, I wanted to learn more about the two histories, the two legacies that our child would inherit, particularly as the only Jewish Japanese American person in our family. So that drew me to this story. And also, I'm a trailing spouse. I gave up my career and world in Boston when I married my husband and moved to Japan. And I'm always sort of thinking about what it means when one spouse gives up their world for another, and the process you go through of making meaning out of your life when it's structured around someone else's world. And when I learned about Elaine, I thought, wow, that's sort of like this situation, this kind of leap of faith, but with exponentially higher stakes. And so I was fascinated by their story. And the more I researched it, the more I realized that the story of mixed race families in and around these camps had remained virtually untold, particularly in narrative nonfiction. There's a little bit of scholarship about it, but nothing written for a general educated audience. And I learned that historians estimate that there were over 2,000 people in mixed race families who were incarcerated in the concentration camps for Japanese Americans for at least some period of time. And among these, there were actually over 130 people with no known Japanese ancestry at all, plus, of course, untold thousands of others who remained outside of the camps who endured separation from their family members. And also, the more I researched, the more I became fascinated and frankly aghast by the government's contorted and at times absurd efforts to figure out what to do about these families, how to categorize, how to police these mixed race families and their individual members in the context of a race-based mass incarceration. So I knew that, beyond my own interest in the story, more broadly for our nation, this was a really important history to tell.
So how do these camps get started? I mean, Pearl Harbor happens. Everyone is freaking out. There's a lot of, racist language getting thrown around. How does this program actually get started? Did anyone bother to come up with a legal rationale? From the government standpoint, how did this program get rolling?
Yeah, it seems hard to believe now in hindsight that it did get rolling, but it certainly did. So yes, you're right. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, sentiment pretty rapidly in the United States turned against the Japanese American population here. It was, that's sentiment against that community was fueled by some racism that, again, in hindsight might look shocking today, but it really wasn't that long ago. So the question of what to do about foreign nationals in actually all three countries with which we very soon became at war with, the question about what to do with immigrants from these three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan. This was a question that was widely discussed. But the focus on the Japanese American community in the United States was sort of steeped in these horribly racist ideas about so-called Japanese blood and Japanese danger, as opposed to, German American and Italian American immigrants. And slowly these conversations turned to encompass all Japanese in the U.S., not just Japanese immigrants. Who, by the way, unlike German and Italian immigrants in the early 1900s, had not been ever given the option to become American citizens after the Immigration Act of 1924 prohibited people from Asian nations from becoming citizens. So, newspapers began to publish editorials, such as one from the LA Times claiming, quote, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American." And this kind of sentiment was, not uncommon in the media. And as John DeWitt, who was the head of the Western Defense Command, wrote in an internal memo, the Japanese is an enemy race. And while many second and third generation Japanese were born on American soil and had become Americanized, he said the, quote, "racial strains are undiluted." So clearly there was a difference in attitude towards and treatment of Japanese Americans versus German and Italian Americans. So when FDR signed Executive Order 9066, as you said, on February 19th, 1942, allowing the Army to remove anyone from a military area that they deemed a threat, the military, egged on in many cases by the media and by many politicians in Congress, decided, in the words of Idaho Governor Chase Clark, that no Japanese should be allowed in his state unless they were, quote, "in concentration camps under military guard." And so this is what the military and the U.S. government did.
So I want to talk about the Yonedas and the life before the camps. I mean, I assume marriages between a Japanese man and a Jewish woman were pretty rare at the time. Who were Karl? Like who were Karl and Elaine? How did they meet? And when did they get married?
Yeah. Their life, even before the incarceration in Manzanar, was really fascinating to me. And we know a good bit about them because they were both prominent labor and leftist activists on the West Coast. And their political agitation and the protests that they led, they were leaders of a lot of labor and anti-fascist protests. And these were covered by the media to a great extent. Elaine was actually known in the media variously as the Red Angel and the Tiger Woman, for her relentless activism and for standing up time and again to what was called LA's Red Squad, which was the police force devoted to combating leftist and pro-labor agitation. She met Karl when she was sent by an organization she worked for called the International Labor Defense Fund, the ILD, to bail him out of prison after he was arrested and severely beaten by the Red Squad at a pro-labor protest. And as you said, mixed marriage was definitely controversial then. Elaine's first marriage, actually, she had been married before she met Karl. Her first marriage had been to a white Irish Catholic man, and her parents didn't seem to really balk at that. But her marriage outside of what they considered her race was sort of another matter, particularly to her mother. And Karl's family was also against the union. And, neither Karl nor Elaine's family were sort of standouts with their antipathy towards mixed marriage. It was extremely common then. Even FDR himself had announced publicly that his support for the severe limits on Japanese immigration to the U.S. in the 1920s was sort of undergirded by his desire to prevent the, quote, "mixing of the blood of the two peoples." And he said the mingling of Asiatic blood with European or American blood produces, in 9 cases out of 10, the most unfortunate results. So and plus the fact mixed marriage, of course, was illegal in California. So Karl and Elaine had to sneak away to Washington State to actually get married. But, neither of them really cared. They had a passionate bond politically, interpersonally, that nothing, not their families, not the law, not public censure could break. Eventually, not even an American concentration camp could break their union.
So war breaks out. This order to go to the camps is kind of placed down. What were the Yoneda's initial reaction to that? I know Karl went first. Why did he go first? And then when did Elaine and Thomas follow?
Karl and Elaine's reaction to the war, their immediate reaction to the war, before the forced removal and incarceration order came down between early December and February 1942. Really, the end of February 1942 was when it became clear that both alien and citizen Japanese Americans were going to be removed and incarcerated. But Karl's initial reaction, immediate reaction to the war, sort of the night of Pearl Harbor, was to gather the readers of he worked for a communist newspaper, a communist Japanese American newspaper, and he gathered the readers of this, his San Francisco sort of community around this newspaper, and they wrote a letter to FDR promising the allegiance of the Japanese American community to the Allied cause above and beyond all else. He was promptly arrested in the next day or two as a leader in the Japanese American community. All the leaders in the Japanese American community were arrested initially. In his case, he was a leader of a Japanese American communist community. And he was only held for, I think, 36 hours and then was released. And the minute he was released, he tried to enlist. But like all Japanese Americans, he was designated unfit for military service. And he lost his job and had no source of income. He worked as a longshoreman on the, they lived on the coast in San Francisco, and many Japanese Americans lost their jobs, many, and everyone who worked on, in anything like shipping or fishing or things like that, were all fired. So he didn't have a job, he didn't have an income. And when the forced removal and incarceration was announced, he sort of had two reactions. One was he claimed that if it proved to be a military necessity to remove the entire Japanese American community from the West Coast, that he would support being moved. There were a lot of rumors circulating that there were, quote, fifth column actors among the Japanese American community. In other words, people who were intent on sabotage. And although there was absolutely no proven evidence of any sabotage among the Japanese American community, many, even liberal commentators and many politicians said, the only reason we haven't seen any sabotage yet is because this community is sort of getting ready to strike when we least expect it. So actually the government had proof in the form of a Navy intelligence report that the Japanese American community posed no significant threat. And even J. Edgar Hoover argued that any removal from the West Coast should be done on an individual and not a racial or group basis. But the Army wanted to, quote, remove them all. So they buried the report. And many in the American public, and even Karl and Elaine, not knowing that this, fifth column threat was really not an actual threat. Karl decided that he kind of had to accept the story that it was a military necessity to remove the entire West Coast Japanese American community, both aliens and citizens, to prove that he was a loyal American. It was really such a tragedy. But he never imagined that his son Tommy would be taken, that they would be locking up infants and 3-year-olds. And he certainly never imagined that Elaine would have to choose between entering Manzanar with Tommy when Tommy was forcibly removed, or letting them take their son without her, or that when they took Tommy, his wife would further have to choose between leaving her white daughter from her first marriage, who was at this point just a young teenager, to stay with their 3-year-old son.
So, what was the Manzanar camp actually like? I mean, what were the living conditions like? What was the accommodation like? Well, like what was the camp actually like for those that had to stay there?
So, particularly when Elaine and Tommy and Carl first arrived, Manzanar was this incredibly barren, en- environment. It was totally unfit for habitation. It was at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, um, not far from Death Valley. And it had barely started being built by the time Carl arrived, and then Elaine and Tommy arrived a week later. There was no hot water for weeks. There were these portable toilets that were pulled back and forth between barracks. They were sort of on this kind of wheeled contraption. They were pulled back and forth between barracks and then emptied into a sewer dish that ran alongside the barracks. And when toilets were finally built, they had no partitions, meaning, for instance, that all the women among the 400 or so people in a cell block had to share 6 toilets among themselves with no privacy whatsoever. Same for the men. I mean, men and women had separate toilets, but there was no privacy. Within those sort of 6, they weren't even stalls; they were just toilets plunked down. Um, the food made people ill frequently. The sandstorms tormented people, particularly. They were particularly pernicious and dangerous for incarcerees like Tommy, who had severe asthma and allergies. And, the environment was, lethal to some incarcerees. In terms of housing, families were frequently forced to bunk together with no privacy, in one barrack room. And the barrack walls had these huge gaping holes in them, and many of them had actually no roofs or even windows when the incarcerees first arrived. But eventually, the incarcerees were able to improve the ground somewhat. They planted things to tamp down the dust, and as the camp finished being built and it reached its maximum population of about 10,000 incarcerees, the barracks at least had roofs and windows. And so the conditions improved somewhat, but it was never anything other than sort of a barren and difficult place to live.
How much do we know about the people that staffed these camps? And I there's a family connection here. My great grandfather, I believe, was the director of adult education at the Granada Relocation Center. Now, like family lore puts it that because he was Jewish, and so family lore puts it that he was so offended by the camps, and particularly given what was going on in Europe, that he volunteered to work in the Granada camp. Obviously, that's family lore. We can't confirm that or substantiate it one way or the other. But in terms of the people that actually worked there, whether they were soldiers or administrators or nurses or whatever, I mean, how much do we know about how they felt about what they were doing?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. And we actually know a fair amount, or there's a fair amount to discover, because there were many reports and documents that were written by staff and filed. The forced removal and incarceration was an incredibly thoroughly documented, I won't say thoroughly, but incredibly broadly documented, um, occasion in our history. Um, it seems as if the staff felt a variety of things. As there were a variety of people who became camp staff. One significant comment, I think, was a comment given by a man named Ned Campbell, who was an administrator at Manzanar when Elaine and Carl were there. And in a later interview about his experience being an administrator in Manzanar, he admitted that he hadn't actually realized when he arrived in camp that he was, quote, dealing with human beings. The incarcerees had seemed like, he said, so many bodies. They were just numbers to him. So that was, the experience of some of the staff. But, there's a really fascinating book actually that was written by a professor named Eric Mueller, who actually his parents, I believe, were both Holocaust survivors. His book is called Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe, Complicity and Conscience in America's World War II Concentration Camps. And he focuses on these three lawyers, white lawyers who worked at three different camps. And they were, tasked with sort of contradictory, really, instructions. On one hand, they needed to provide legal counsel to the prisoners, and so to help them, and to keep the place running at the same time. So they had to help keep the camps intact. And Mueller's book sort of asks what it means to be, as he writes, complicit in a system that strips people of their freedoms and sometimes endangers their lives, even though it seems from the documentation that many people, not all, but many people did work in the camps with the hope of, helping somewhat in some way. But it is a really sort of interesting line and conundrum. So
there were a couple things on reading your book that they kind of struck me as stuff I didn't quite know before. One thing that struck me was that, as Karl writes several times, there really was at least some pro-Japanese sentiment among the Issei and the Nisei population. How did the camp kind of worsen these, or but intensify kind of the disagreements and tensions within the Japanese American community?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that is also an aspect of the camps that certainly Karl and Elaine tussled with, and I certainly tussled with as well as I was researching their story. There was an incredible mix of people who were thrown together in these camps. It was a diverse mix in terms of ideology, in terms of economics, politics, generation, and even ethnicity. And that's actually, I realized working on the book, that's really important for us to remember, because the lie upon which the entire forced removal and incarceration was built was that the Japanese community was sort of just one homogenous community. But in terms of this pro-Japanese sentiment in the camp, there were some expressions of support in Manzanar for Japan, and these expressions of support grew louder as the incarceration wore on, and some people wondered about what felt to them like the lie of American democracy and freedom, as their incarceration dragged on. And the Issei were, an interesting category. The Issei were the first generation. These were the immigrants who had come from Japan and moved here, and then in most cases had children who were American citizens born in the United States. So they were Japanese immigrants, but as I had mentioned earlier, they had never been given the chance to be anything else. They'd been denied the right to become American citizens because of their race. So, even Elaine herself noted that the U.S. government had basically encouraged them, perhaps unwittingly, but still undeniably, to maintain some connection to the country of their birth, because that was the only country that would claim them as citizens. So there were some people in the camps who did end up voicing support for the Japanese war effort, and others who ended up, a larger group who ended up voicing anger towards the American administration of the camps and the American government that was, backing and supporting them. And it seems that sometimes these things seem to merge and meld under the pressures, of an incarceration to which no one knew whether there was ever going to be an end. And, for Elaine and Karl, this was very hard and very scary. They knew really intimately, particularly as consumers of the leftist press and as, consumers of, media that was sort of trickling out about what was happening in Nazi-occupied Europe. They knew that were Japan and Germany to win the war, they in particular, as a Jewish-Japanese family, particularly with prominent leftist and anti-fascist reputation, that they would not survive. Were the axis to win.
That's right, and there are definitely some people. Well, I mean, certainly Karl and Elaine think this, but also people who come to the camp for the express purpose of looking up how not great they were at the end of it, would say, well, I mean, unfortunately, defeating Hitler is the priority. And another thing that kind of, I mean, I think I knew this, but the popular conception is that no one had any idea the Holocaust was going on until the camps were liberated in 44. When that was not true. I mean, as you note in the book, like this stuff, like that news was getting out into the U.S. People knew about it, which I guess then intensified some of the mixed feelings people had about highlighting the camps in the U.S.
Yes, definitely. And for Karl and Elaine, this was a huge struggle, because they desperately wanted to support the Allied war effort. Many people in the camps wanted to support the Allied war effort. Many, American citizens wanted that. But I think Karl and Elaine had a sort of unique window into, or a unique sort of take on their own fears about, what would happen if the Allies lost. They were the only Jewish Japanese mixed family on record in any of the camps. Um, they and they the only way that they were sort of able to maintain their connection to the leftist community outside of camp, which was really sort of what fed their soul, their connection to the leftist community, well before the war. They were passionate activists, and when they were taken to Manzanar, they had to give up so much. I mean, they gave up less than some other families than most other families actually materially, because they at least had family who could stay outside of camp. And, Elaine's family, they could sort of, watch their stuff, and so they lost less than a lot of people, but they sort of, the only thing in some ways they had left was sort of this fight in their soul to continue their leftist fight and their anti-fascist fight. And if they really want to maintain their connection to the leftist community outside of camp, which they deeply did, they repeatedly wrote letters to the leftist media and to their friends outside of camp. If they wanted to maintain their connection to this community, this was a line that they had to support. And by maintaining their ties to that community outside the camp, this message was reinforced both by and to them repeatedly, that the fight against the Axis had to take precedence, and any question about whether or not the camps were a civil rights violation in the United States would have to be left until after the war, that they could not cause an issue for the American government, and they needed to continually stress how the American camps were sort of a representation of democratic intention versus the Axis camps, which were just pure barbarity.
How do Karl and then Elaine eventually leave the camp?
Well, I think I'm going to leave some of that to the reader to discover. The question of whether, when, and how Elaine, Karl, and Tommy end up leaving or escaping the camp. I will say that when Karl went to Manzanar, he went with the absolute unwavering intention of finding a way to join the war effort. And he did. He ended up leaving Manzanar before Elaine and Tommy. He ended up being one of the very first volunteers from any of the concentration camps to volunteer to go to, the Pacific Theater. He was recruited to be in the military intelligence service, but he served, he worked on the battlefields, basically as an interpreter and as a he called a propaganda writer. So he would write leaflets to sort of try to they would airdrop them on the battlefield and try to encourage the Japanese soldiers to surrender, and that they would be treated fairly if they surrendered. And so he left the camp after almost 9 months there, and Elaine and Tommy were left alone in the camp when a phenomenon called what Elaine and Karl refer to in hindsight as the Manzanar riot. Historians generally refer to it now as the Manzanar uprising. But when sort of tensions within the camp among different factions sort of came to a boil, and it was a violent, and for some incarcerees a fatal occurrence.
So how do views of the Japanese camps change after the war? I mean, I know obviously like today, and certainly has been the thought for several decades now that the Japanese camps were, one of the gravest injustices done by the United States. Everyone hates the Korematsu decision in 1944, but immediately kind of after the war and in the years following, I mean, how do views of the camps change?
I think it took a long time for views to change. Um, think the Japanese American community worked really hard and really bravely to, change American sentiment about it, and also to support the reparations movement. Karl and Elaine also were deeply involved in this movement. But when the war first ended and incarcerees began leaving the camps, there was, still horrible and at times quite violent racism against Japanese Americans, against returning incarcerees. I'll give just one set of examples from one of the paragraphs towards the end of my book, where I document that there were, dozens of shootings and arson attacks that had flared across the West Coast as incarcerees returned home after the war from camp. One situation, a family was eating dinner only to have 6 shotgun blasts burst through their window. Others were sleeping in a house that was sprayed with gasoline and lit on fire. And in a different instance, people tried to escape an arson attempt only to be shot at as they fled into the open. One family had 2 sons who had served in the war. One had been killed in battle, and the other had been decorated for bravery. And when they returned from camp, they found their home and their possessions completely burned. Meanwhile, 3 white men were charged with placing a bomb on a returnee's farm, and they were acquitted after their attempts. A defense attorney claimed, "This is a white man's country. Let's keep it so." So I don't think there was much sentiment that the camps were wrong in the beginning. After the war, there was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, and that unfortunately, encompassed in many people's minds, Japanese Americans, even though there's, really no necessarily similarity between a Japanese American and a Japanese, soldier. Just like my family is originally from Russia. There's no correlation between me, we're Russian Jews, between me and anyone necessarily in the Russian military right now. But eventually, sentiment changed, and the 1988 Civil Liberties Act did allow for reparations for people who had been incarcerated. Not anyone who was not Japanese American or Japanese, though. For instance, Elaine was not, would not have counted as someone who could have been compensated. So the mixed race family members who were not of Japanese descent were left out of this. But for the main, by the late 80s, I think the country had sort of turned the corner and realized what a dark chapter in our history this was.
So maybe to kind of close this off, I mean, so some of the concepts, some of the terms that pop up in this book kind of still have resonance today. I mean, the idea of family separation pops up immediately in the opening chapter when the officials are trying to separate Thomas and Elaine. Family separation is a term that has a lot of resonance today, given some of the conversations around immigration enforcement and stuff like that. I mean, like, how does the history of these camps, still hold importance for today's United States?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think it holds importance because it's a huge part of our history, but I think, sort of leading from your question, it also holds significance today because of things that are happening today. The story of the Yonedas and the mass incarceration in which they're swept up is a story of an American family that's caught up in sort of the maelstrom of what was happening in the United States at a significant inflection point. And I think we're at another inflection point now where we're really questioning the nature of American democracy. And it also seems at the same time like there are many false narratives about who or what is dangerous among us. And those narratives are being used to serve certain purposes and certain people in power. Important point to remember is that what happened to the Japanese American West Coast community during the war started out as a discussion about immigrants, and it rather quickly turned into the incarceration of 80 to 90,000 U.S. born citizens. So this fantasy about finding the danger within, it ended up separating thousands of families, particularly mixed race families, as in the case of the Yonedas. And you can see in the Yoneda's story the steep cost of this breaking apart of their family. And it's just not something that as a nation we should really ever do if we can help it. Separating families should be a red line if there's not a clear and present and fully documented, immediate danger posed to the public by one member of that family. And I also want to add that we can also see a parallel today between the forced removal and incarceration of one entire category of U.S. citizens. We can see a parallel between that and the stripping of civil rights and protections from entire categories of American citizens today, like the trans community. So I think both of those phenomena that are happening today are sort of just a disturbing echo of the forced removal and incarceration. And we need to kind of remember that.
So I think that's a great place to end our conversation with Tracy Slater, author of Together in Manzanar, The True Story of a Japanese Jewish Family in an American Concentration Camp. Tracy, I have two final questions for you, which are, where can people find your work? Not just this book, but all of your work. And second question, what's next for you? What do you think the next project might be?
Well, people can find my work at my website, which is just www.tracyslater.com. So that's no E in Tracy, TracySlater.com. And what's next for me, I'm just starting to work on a new book project that is also at the intersection of Jewish and Japanese history. This book project is looking at the experience of the over 2,000 refugees from Nazi Europe who escaped the Holocaust and survived the war almost uniformly by passing through Kobe, Japan, actually. So a lot has been written about the Japanese diplomat who gave them their visas, their sort of transit visas to Japan. And a lot has been written about the Shanghai ghetto, where many of them ended up after they went to Japan. But very little has been written about their time in Kobe. And Kobe is actually where my husband was born. And right now we're located in Toronto temporarily, but we're in the process of moving back to Japan, back to the Kobe area. So, this new project also holds a lot of parallels for me, kind of in my experience and in my heart.
So you can follow me, Nicholas Gordon, on Twitter at NickRIGordon. That's NickRigordon. You can go to AsianReviewBooks.com to find other reviews, essays, interviews, and excerpts. Follow them on Twitter at Book Reviews Asia. That's reviews plural. And you can find many more author reviews at the New Books Network at newbooksnetwork.com. We're on all of your podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Rate us, recommend us, share us with your friends to support us interviewing those writing in, around, and about Asia. Next week, join us for an interview with Elizabeth Weber about her new translation of Wu Jianren's New Story of the Stone. But before then, Tracy, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. It was such a treat to be with you.